friend, he mentioned
so yeah, you can not see my head. On the other hand, there we go. Okay, thank you. Okay, hello everybody, and greetings to those of you who are here with us at UCLA and those who are watching on Zoom or YouTube. My name is Professor Ann Karagosian, and it is my privilege as the director of the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute to welcome you to our latest hybrid event that is in person and remote, which is a presentation on victims and executioners of the Stalin era repressions in the multidirectional memory of post-Soviet Armenia. This is a lecture that will be delivered to us by Dr. Gayane Shagoyan of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography at the National Academy of Sciences in the Republic of Armenia. We are especially pleased to offer this event as part of UCLA's 2022 International Education Week, and to welcome Dr. Shagoyan to discuss with us her very important research pertaining to the memory of trauma, surviving genocide, and repression intact. The subject, of course, refers to not only the Soviet and post-Soviet eras in Armenian history, but is also relevant to the more recent political situation, of course, in the Republic of Armenia and its complicated relations with Russia. Before I turn this program over to our dear colleague, Dr. Melissa Bilal, who will formally introduce Dr. Shagoyan, let me mention that this lecture is co-sponsored by the UCLA Armenian Music Program, the UCLA Richard Hovhannissian Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History, the UCLA Working Group in Memory Studies, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, or NASR, and the Ararat Eskidjan Museum. And on behalf of the Promise Armenian Institute and others of us at UCLA, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the indigenous Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Now it gives me great pleasure to turn the event over to Dr. Melissa Bilal, who is the Associate Director of the Armenian Music Program in the Herb Alpert School of Music at UCLA and is a lecturer in the Department of Ethnomusicology. Previously, Dr. Bilal taught at the American University of Armenia in Yerevan, and it has also held teaching and research positions at the University of Chicago, MIT, Columbia University, Boğaziçi University, and the Orient Institute in Istanbul. In 2017, Dr. Bilal collaborated with Dr. Lerna Ekmekcioglu of MIT to launch the Feminist Armenian Studies Workshop, and the two of them are co-editors of the book, A Cry for Justice, 5 Armenian Feminist Writers from the Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey, 1862 to 1933. Dr. Bilal holds a PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of Chicago and MA and BA degrees in sociology from Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. So, Melissa, I will now turn this event over to you for a more detailed introduction of our speaker.
Thank you, and hi everyone, welcome. I would like to introduce our speaker tonight. Gayane Shagoyan is a senior researcher at the Department of Contemporary Anthropological Studies of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography of National Academy of Sciences of Armenia. She received her PhD in anthropology from the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in 2010. And her research areas include daily life, urban anthropology, and memory studies. And she's the author of about 90 publications, including the book 7 Days and 7 Nights, Panorama of the Armenian Wedding, 2011, and the co-author of Stalin-era Repressions in Armenia, History, Memory, and Daily Life in 2015 in Yerevan. And she's the editor of the book Unheard Voices, Memory and Post-Memory in Oral History, published in 2018. And Gayane is a good friend and colleague of mine with whom we have been collaborating on oral history and memory studies, teaching and research projects in Armenia. And I am thankful that she accepted our invitation to give this lecture tonight on a topic that is very important, but also understudied. And the title of her lecture tonight is Victims and Executioners of the Stalin-era Repressions in the Multidirectional Memory of Post-Soviet Armenia. Thank you.
What is that?
Yeah, let's share on it. Share on it. There we go. I'm grateful to all organizers of this event, and I would like to thank my thanks to especially Melissa and other organizers who did this event possible. Really, it's a great honor to be for me to be here and share with you my thoughts on the topic about which I've already mentioned. My presentation is about the post-Soviet memorialization of Stalin-era repressions in Armenia. And you know, of course, the studies of Armenian memory most often focus on the topic of the Armenian Genocide in the Ottoman Empire. Chapters or even special volumes in memory or oblivion studies are devoted to the case, and you can find them in the books of Rona Yerman, Alida Osman, Dan Reiner, and others. And of course, the memory of the genocide is especially important for the Armenian diaspora, for which his memory served as a myth of beginning and was perceived as the main component of national identity. Again, according to Rona Yerman and Richard Marusan. Depending on this preferred theoretical framework, researchers consider the memory of the Armenian genocide also as a master narrative, like Dan Diner does, or as a root paradigm, like Victor Turner and Noam Ludwig following Turner for the Armenian case. But the memory of the genocide is also important in terms of its influence on other historical events. Sometimes it is perceived as a computing memory that has engulfed the entire space of memory and thus eclipsed the memory of other historical events. I will try to show this is not always the case. The memory of the genocide, both institutional and individual, has developed a topic against the politics of forgetting, which is used to voice other traumatic events they are hushed up. In other words, different memories interact with each other, not so much in a competitive mode, but rather as a multidirectional memory, which, according to Michael Rothberg, is such a public representation of traumatic memory that it's a cross-reference, produce cross-reference, and it's produce more memory than reduce it. And little-known historical events are not supplanted by the memory of the dominant cultural trauma, but on the contrary, they receive ready-made tools for public representation. As a comparative case, I will focus mainly on the problem of the victim's memory and the attitude towards the executioners of the Stalin-era repressions. And as we'll see in some cases, the genocide memory and Stalin repressions can develop in parallel, but independently of each other. In other cases, the memory of repressions is formed according to the genocide memory patterns, when the memory of repression repeats some of the mechanisms developed in connection with the genocide memory. And thirdly, the memory of repression can be contrasted or merged with the memory of genocide. In Armenia, the genocide memory has turned from silence into loud recognition. And this experience of resisting the politics of oblivion becomes a valuable resource for other repressed collective traumas. While the Stalin purges in Armenia were accompanied by mass deportations, which according to the latest data affected at least 19,000 Armenians. However, even today, they do not become the subject of the public discourse in Armenia. First of all, because of not being qualified as a national deportation, but targeting different social groups, like nationals, collaborators, former Turkish or Greek citizens, etc. So it's never turned down into a national narrative and stayed as a smaller group trauma. It can be seen well when comparing two commemorations, the Armenian Genocide and their remembrance of the victims of repression in Yerevan. Both are included in the official calendar of the post-Soviet Armenia. The Day of Repressions on June 14 has been commemorated in Armenia since 2006. The day was chosen because the deportation campaign called Volna, the Wave in Russian, happened on June 14 in 1949, when about 13,000 people were exiled from Armenia and 6,000 deportees were from Georgia, Azerbaijan, and the northern Black Sea region. The official opening of the memorial took place in December 2008. The memorial was opened by President Serge Sargsyan, and it was the same year when the post-election protests had been suppressed on March 1st, and 10 people were killed during these clashes. Possibly, the participation of the President of Armenia and many other officials was a PR action to show their loyalty to democratic values, despite the fact of killed protesters. Representatives of the authorities, including the president, were present only at the opening of the monument. After this, none of the authorities has taken part in the commemoration till today. Whereas not only over 500,000 people go to the genocide monument on average every year, February 24th, but under pandemic conditions in 2020, about 340,000 people registered on the online platform. There was also an opportunity to be registered virtually at the monument. This turned the monument not only into a memorial to the victims, but also into a memorial to those who remember. This is the case when the institutionalized and individual memories, even post-memories, are closing at one point because of referring to their cultural trauma, if we use the term of Jeffrey Alexander. Following the genocide commemoration pattern, the commemoration of the Soviet-era repressions, instead of having an everyday working museum, is focused on on the one-day memorial concept. The memorial of repressed people is open only on June 14th. The other days, the huge memorial is locked and very few people have any information where it is located, and even that there is such kind of memorial in the center of Yerevan. The memorial may seem very impressive. It is big enough, located on top of the cascade, which is a popular tourist destination in Yerevan. It seemed that the memorial should be much known, even more than the museums of Soviet occupation in Georgia or some Baltic countries. However, because the memorial is accessible to the public only one day a year, following the example of the main day of remembrance of the victims of the genocide, it has become almost invisible and works as a very local memorial for a smaller group of the Stalin repression survivors and their relatives. In 2021 and 2022, due to the memorial organization activists from Russia, a new wave of the revitalization of the names of Stalin-era repressions victims, which is called Returning the Names, is taking place in Armenia. This event trended to become a new tradition and to be integrated into the international commemoration of the Stalin-era victims. It is worth mentioning that the memorial organization back in Russia was awarded the Nobel Prize in Peace 2022. But this external evolving in the memory landscape does not solve the problem of facing own history of the Stalinist period. Members of the Hushamadzyan, this is the Armenian NGO, consisted mainly of the victims of the Soviet repressions and their descendants for several years unsuccessfully tried to raise the issue of creating a museum of this memorial. They believe that only in this way it is possible to turn the memorial from one-day monument into a functioning memory. The case of the Genocide Institute Museum at the Genocide Memorial is a good example showing that the museum next to the monument or combined with it may be the only possible institutional solution for the memorial maintenance. The reason why the genocide memory not only has gradually grown into a master narrative in Armenian public discourse, but also serve as a language to describe other tragedies, including the Stalin repression, could be understood due to Dan Diner's concept on ethnocide memory. Diner thinks that non-ethnic groups can't form a remembering social group, and thereby explains the longevity of genocide memory as compared with other group memories. Alexander Atkins disagreed with this statement, providing numerous examples from post-Soviet Russian memory of the repressions. He provides a lot of examples, but his examples are overshadowed by ethnicized memory specific for the same time period. For instance, in Ukraine, the peasantry does not possess collective memory per se, and the mass persecutions of the kulaks do not become a collective memory of this specific group, but rather are modified and grow into a part of all Ukrainian traumatic memory that qualified as originally planned anti-Ukrainian genocide. On the other hand, the punished people of the Stalin era, using various commemorative practices, are more likely to remember Soviet repressions compared to the people who suffered from the Great Terror, but were not directly targeted as the ethnic group. For example, memory trains, which following the example of Jewish pilgrimage tours to concentration camps, were also organized for the Kalmyks, one of the punished peoples at Stalin era, which was completely deported to Siberia. The group of former deportees from Armenia to Siberia unsuccessfully attempted to organize the same for themselves. While visiting not only the former Armenian settlements in Western Armenia, but even their Zor, have become commercial projects for private travel companies due to their greater demand. And the deportation of Armenians to Siberia was not ethnocized, was not assessed as a deportation of punished peoples, neither for those who made the decision, nor by the exiles themselves, and this plot fell out of the national narrative. Moreover, in the local histories of the Armenian communities of Siberia, for example, of Barnaul or Tomsk, which are the Siberian cities, where the Armenians were deported in 1949 and migrated voluntarily in 1990s, the deportation plot is avoided. Although for them the topic of deportation could theoretically become a best myth. In Barnaul, which was a place of many exiles, there is a city monument to the Soviet repressed. Around this memorial, commemorations are regularly held only by the local German community, sometimes also Kalmyks, although there are about 40,000 Barnaul residents themselves, local victims of Stalin's repression in this city. That is, even urban identity turned out to be an insufficient basis for the formation of the longevity of group memory. In other Siberian cities that received many exiles not only of the Soviet but also of the pre-Soviet period, in Tomsk, in front of the local Museum of Memorial, at the Silent International Memorial Organization, where there is a park, and in this park there are monuments which are set up by different ethnic communities having in Russia the status of the national minorities. That is, even the most superficial review of the memorial landscape confirms the Diner's assumption that the ethnicized memory has more resources for developing into a national master memory. To compare, the Barnaul Armenian community could fund not only to annual commemoration of April 24th, but in 2015, in the year of the genocide centenary, a huge model of the Yerevan memorial to the genocide victims was installed in the courtyard of the local Armenian church. But the Soviet deportation of Armenians just there to Siberia has no any commemoration. I am on purpose referring to those cases of the commemorative practices of the Armenian diaspora in Russia, for which this deportation was actually part of their microhistory. I think for so-called old diaspora in other countries, these events are not reflected in their memorial landscape at all. Whereas it is difficult to find any Armenian community in diaspora where there would not be a monument dedicated to the genocide, and now also to those who perished in the Karabakh War, unfortunately, to one more traumatic national narrative. Let me show a couple of cases when the choice of historical research is determined by the relevance of the national agenda, sometimes at the expense of the topic Soviet repressions. For example, in the family of our colleague, Marutian, there was a valuable manuscript, the Siberian Diaries of his mother, which she wrote down in exile in 1949, 1954, but their publication followed only after the publication of her son's book on the reflection of the genocide memory in the Karabakh movement. Another author, Grisha Sambatyan, who is from Syunik, who in the early 1980s recorded oral histories about repressions, returned to this topic only after publishing a monograph about the Karabakh War that had begun much later. At the same time, the experience of the unrecognized genocide memory created mechanisms of resistance to the policy of denialism. For example, in post-Soviet Armenia, as a result of the dependence on Russia, which did not really contribute to public discussion of the topics of repression, it to study the policy of oblivion concerning the Stalin era repressions. However, their memorialization took place due to the tools used when dealing with the genocide memory, recording the oral histories and their archiving as the historical testimonies. Not surprised that those tools were provided by the Armenian diaspora. Thus, in post-Soviet Armenia, the first documentary, Enemy of the People, based on the oral histories of the Stalin repressions, was created by the American Armenian filmmaker Zare Cheknavoya. The project was funded by the AGBA in 1997-1998. Zare Cheknavoya recorded about 100 video interviews, each at average 1 hour, with former prisoners of the Gulag or deported to Siberia. While Armenian researchers, including myself, within the project of the Armenian Totalitaries, began to record the kind of materials only 15 years later. That means that we were able to have interviews mainly with the second generation of the repressed families. The family stories of these people, as a rule, begin not from the deportation and not even with the birth year of the narrator, but with the history of the genocide, from the moment when their parents hardly escaped the massacres and moved to Eastern Armenia, which soon became the Soviet Republic. Such start of the narration is because the deportation of many families to Siberia was often caused by their former Turkish citizenship. The order of the Minister of the State Security of the USSR, number 00183 on the deportation of 1949, concerned primarily former Turkish and Greek citizens. Therefore, people who barely escaped death in Ottoman Empire made up 68% of the deported families from Armenia in 1949. Moreover, at their new destination in Siberia, in the registration books, they were abbreviated as Turks, and they had to put their signature under such definition regularly at the local militia offices. In the biography of our interlocutors, 3 regimes covered: Young Turkeys, fascism, and Stalinism, the crimes of which Hannah Arendt, in her book The Origin of Totalitarianism, and Pope Francis II, in his speech on centennial anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, put on one line. Moreover, some of our interlocutors became the victim of the Soviet regime because of suffering from genocide or captivity in fascist camps. We often came across family stories when the same family, the same people were victims of all regimes. Escaping the genocide, they moved to Armenia. Here, they had to serve in the Soviet army and participated in World War II, where they found themselves in fascist captivity, and then were exiled to Siberia because of this captivity with their families in 1949. Sorry, I just stay here. Comparative plots of 20th century Armenian history differ for the Armenians of Armenia and of the diaspora. While for the latter, the master narrative of collective memory is clearly the theme of the Armenian genocide, there are 2 master narratives for the citizens of Armenia, 2 languages of memory representation. This is not only genocide, but also the Second World War, which in the Soviet Union was called exclusively the Great Patriotic War, and the memory of it was sacralized. Until now, its even academic revisiting in Russia is strictly censored. For example, comparisons between Stalinism and fascism are prohibited. In Soviet Armenia, the memory of genocide and of the lost homeland was persecuted in the first half of the 20th century. The survivors struggling for the public representation of their trauma in the second half of the century. Compare rallies in 1965 and the Genocide Memorial, which was built in 1967, to become an important component of the state politics of independent Armenia. This is a narrative about victimization, suffering, and surviving against the racist plans of a treacherous enemy. The second master narrative is a heroic text of the Second World War, where the enemy is described as absolute evil, which was opposed primarily by the Soviet people, including the Armenian people, who fought both as part of the Soviet troops and in the Allied armies. The representation of this war in public space during the Soviet period and the Brezhnev stagnation in the 1960s and 1980s strongly influenced the identity of the Homo Sovieticus. It is a deeply internalized language of memorial practices. Therefore, many post-Soviet countries refer to this war, to its commemoration, when they want to celebrate their new victories. For example, as the Armenian side did in the First Karabakh War, compare the coincidence of Shushi-Sija celebration with May 9, the victory celebration of the Great Patriotic War, and how Azerbaijan does after the victory in the Second Karabakh War of 2020, which on the official invitation of their embassy in Moscow was called the Patriotic War, like the Great Patriotic War. And in the first year, as you see on this slide, the first year of the celebration of the victory in Azerbaijan, a parade of the Regiment of the Immortals were organized. The Regiment of the Immortals is a concept that appeared in the memorial practice of post-Soviet Russia when people tried to oppose their personal and tragic memory of the war to the official great victory. This initiative was adopted by the Russian authorities into an official celebration. In Azerbaijan, it has been transformed into a strictly controlled official memory where the army carries the portraits of the perished of the format while marching. Such a language of patriotic war is understandable not only to the Soviet and post-Soviet communities of the national states, but it is also a shift to the language of the former metropolis, I mean Russia, whose position in the Karabakh conflict is still palpable. And in this sense, the use of the memorial language of post-Soviet Russia when describing its national victories indicates rather an important atrophy of these festivities or the colonial language of multidirectional memory, which makes one talk about victories or failures in the memorial language of others in order to be correctly heard. Narratives of deportation are more variable compared to the stories about genocide and Great Patriotic War, which do not have canonized formulas, starting from periodization, from the dates of the greater or Soviet repressions in general, to common definitions for executioners. In the interviews, they were called very different ways, like informers, traitors, even materialists. This is very interesting because they meant who wrote the material denunciation. But texts about the genocide before becoming the main narrative passed their latent period of mimicry as other Soviet narratives. Kremlin authorities, according to Ronald Sunny, learned from the history of the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian or Ottoman empires that it is better to be friends with the national elites and help them to build the national states, but that should be under control of the Communist Party. So the principle socialist in content, but national in form, this is the Stalin proclamation, is the main point of the national politics of the Soviet Empire. Therefore, many intellectuals looked for some loopholes where, under the guise of national culture, they could voice the issue of the genocide. For example, folklorist Vergennes Fazla disguised the collection of eyewitness stories by formalizing her work as a collection of folklore material for the study of Western Armenian dialects. The architect from Gyumri, former Leninakan, Raphael Yahoyan, who listened many stories about the massacre of Armenians next to Gyumri Gorge called Jartizor, which means a massacre gorge, suggested the local administration of Leninakan to erect a monument in memory of killed Armenians in the massacre realized by the Turkish army in 1920. The memorial was formally indicated as a decorated stone source of water, which was often built along the road. The local authorities financed the construction of this monument without indicating in their official reports the true purpose of the memorial. When the local taxi drivers learned about the author's idea, they collected money, offering to use it for the memorial. This example shows how the memory politics of the local authorities and personal memory of common residents coincide, both being directly affected by the genocide. The head of the Communist Party of Armenia, Yakov Zarubyan, in 1964 and 65, began negotiations with Moscow regarding the construction of the national monuments dedicated to genocide. Although here too the aim of the monument was originally disguised by the official narrative of the Armenian resurrections after the World War I. In the center of the memorial, built in 1967, was an eternal flame, which in the 1960s appeared as an obligatory attribute of many monuments to the unknown soldier. This is very Soviet one, dedicated to the perished in World War II. So, despite the monuments reflect the very national narrative, the Armenian catastrophe is presented in the same language and the same visual forms as the memorial of the Second World War. As we see, the formula of the national policy of the USSR, national in form and socialist in content, here turned out to the contrary one. It's more likely socialist or rather Soviet in form and national in content. There were many attempts to testify the loss of the homeland in some form of publicity at the individual level as well, which, although not affected with genocide memory, but developed in a very similar way. For example, on the gravestones of genocide survivors who died in Soviet Armenia, not only the year of birth and death of the deceased was indicated as usually, but also the place of birth, the name of the settlement in Turkey from where the deceased was forced to immigrate. Thus, the tombstone was supposed to act as evidence of the displacement of residents from Western Armenia and the deprivation of their homeland. I recorded a similar practice among the Armenians deported to Siberia in 1949, who after their rehabilitation and return to Armenia, began to transport the ashes of their relatives who died in Siberia to their homeland. On the gravestone of these people, next to the year of their death, excuse me, something is missed, okay. And inscription appeared about the place of death, the first burial and the year of reburial. Until 2008, various tragedies were compared to genocide, presenting the Armenians as victims and enemies presented as Turks. However, after the above-mentioned killing of protesters in Yerevan 2008, the ethnic demarcation between victims and executioners began to blur. That year, during a morning demonstration at the memorial complex, along with the usual genocidal posters, the opposition carried a poster with the inscription 1.5 million plus 10. It was a paraphrase of a poster about the murder of the Turkish journalist of Armenian origin, Hrant Dink, 1.5 million plus 1. The placement of victims as executioners within common ethnic boundaries was also made in 2014 regarding an attempt to erect a monument to Anastas Mikoyan in one of the central parks of Yerevan. Mikoyan, as one of the rare long-livers of the Soviet nomenclatura, turned out to be a very convenient occasion to launch public discussions on the Soviet past, since he participated in many important historical events. Historian Pietro Shagoyan studied in detail about Mikoyan's positive role in the rehabilitation of the Soviet regime victims in general and the Armenian ones in particular. He has found very important facts about Mikoyan's public talks on Charents in Yerevan State University on March 11, 1954, after which the process of Charents rehabilitation was launched. Although, for honesty, it must be admitted that the change in relation to the memory of Charents and some other prominent Armenian writers did not mean the rehabilitation of other victims or an appropriate way of rehabilitation of their rights, including even Charents' wife, who was arrested according to Article 69. These articles for non-denunciation, this is the official title of the Article 69, and was never rehabilitated. At least we couldn't find the appropriate document in her case in National Archive. In dialogue with the authorities, representatives of the movement against the standing up of the monument appealed to the facts of Mikoyan's biography, which could be interpreted as crimes of varying degrees, starting from national, more often stories related to genocide, to indifference to repressed friends or relatives. But main accusations were based on the document widely circulated in social media, where Mikoyan asked for additional 700 executions for Armenians, while documents on shooting much more victims of non-Armenian origin, for example, 22,000 Polish officers in Katyn case, or 5,000 prisoners in Irkutsk, and many others, were less accentuated. The political context, the association of Armenia with the Russian-led customs union instead of the European Union, unexpectedly proclaimed by Serge Sargsyan on the 3rd of September 2030, created a suitable space for hot discussions on relations, historical or current, with Russia. So the proposal to erect Mikoyan's monument became a part of the discourse on the recolonization of Armenia by Russia. While the supporters of the monument appealed to its positive image, referring to Mikoyan's input in the resolution of the Caribbean crisis, the successful modernization of the food industry, or other cases. At the same time, discrepancies in the biographies of many political figures, both Soviet, Anastas Mikoyan, and anti-Soviet, Gayane, are good examples of selective oblivion. When, as Alida Asma states, national memory is subordinated to a sense of pride and to memory of one's suffering, but one's fault rarely gets access to the national memory. While the protests in Armenia against the monument to Anastas Mikoyan stopped its erection, Accusations from Russia and Azerbaijan concerning the monument to Gayane began immediately after its opening in 2016. For them, Gayane was only a Nazi collaborator, while the Armenians consider Najde as the savior of Zangief, who didn't allow this region to follow the fate of Nakhichevan and Karabakh, which were included into Azerbaijan a bit later in the early 20th century. Such disputes over the monuments to Najde continues to this day, but the border between the opponents' camps basically coincides with the state borders. There is a consensus within Armenia about the important role of Najde in the national development of Armenia, and selective oblivion allows to bypass the topics of collaborationism. And in the disputes about the monument to Mikoyan, the ethnic framework for the executioners was expanded and embraced the image of a Soviet officials of Armenian origin. In the case of Najde, they were narrowed so much as to pass only the image of a national hero. Even his collaborationism was interrupted as an attempt to protect Armenian in the case of possible Turkish attack, which was expected during the Second World War. The memorial initiatives in the post-Soviet Armenia indicate that the attitude towards the so-called executioners is no longer so unambiguous. It must be said that the tradition of solo initiatives to erect monuments through the effort of the community is a widespread practice in Armenia. It gained its greatest scope after the Second World War, and the memorials that appeared in almost every village to those who perished in the war did not mean formal monuments to the unknown soldier, but were dedicated to specific victims from this concrete settlement, whose names were indicated on the memorial. More than 600 such monuments have been recorded in Armenia, and the process of their installation continues to this day, because the relatives of the victims perceive these monuments as a symbolic grave of relatives who did not return from the war. It is not surprising that some of these monuments turned out to be close to the religious structures, churches, chapels and places of pilgrimage, especially those that were erected in the post-Soviet period. That is, these places of memory can be considered not so much as memorials, like reminders of the past, but following Paul Conacher as loci of memory, topography with a certain form of behavior, rituals inscribed in everyday life. Unlike monument cenotaphs to those killed in the Second World War, where the state or local administration sponsored or encouraged their installation, monuments to the repressed are usually erected at the expense of the families of the victims. They are, of course, still significantly smaller in number. I recorded about 15 such monuments, but they have in common with the monuments of the Second World War, and it is that they also bear concrete names. The initiatives of erecting the monuments to the repressed are usually their descendants. Even the official memorial complex in Yerevan dedicated to the victims of Stalin purges was designed by the architect Jim Torotsan, who himself was the son of a repressed person. In rare cases, such initiatives come from representatives of the local administration, as was the case, for example, in the village of Arachazor in the south of Armenia, again means unique. The decision of the chairman of the community to erect a monument in 2011 with the name of fellow villagers who were executed by shooting appeared under the influence of reading the book On This Side of the Iron Curtain, published by local historian Repressions, by telling about whom I mentioned. The most notable part of the monument is the free space left after the names of the repressed to be able to write in the names of the victims who may be found in the future. This free space defined the new concept of the monument as an unfinished text, as an invitation to conversation, and where instead of period there is an ellipsis. Another important point for local initiatives to establish a monument to the repressed is the choice of the site. In rare cases, the location is determined by the topography of the historical event. The difficulty is that the places of executioners were not recorded anywhere, and it is impossible to restore them even from archival documents. There is some oral information that requires additional research, as it was the case in the already mentioned massacre gorge near Leningrad. Some of our interlocutors argued that the victims of the Great Terror in 1960, 36 and 37 were buried there also, just several years later after the Turkish massacre. The first 12 Soviet memorial stone in memory of the political victims of the Soviet regime in Armenia was erected in 1993, which was replaced in 2008 by a cross stone in the English Park of Yerevan at the place where the 21 arrested persons accused of organizing a uprising in 1921 were cruelly executed by the Bolsheviks. For the initiators of the monuments to the repressed in the village of Gov, an important message was the lessons of history that need to be learned by descendants. Therefore, they chose a site near the school for the monument. It was important for the initiators that the monument does not have any religious connotation. Therefore, they did not make it in the form of a cross stone, as usually genocide memorials are created, especially in diaspora, setting up near a church, but they wanted to emphasize that the monument has a civil message, both for memory and oblivion. Forgetfulness here acts as a punishment. In the center of the monument, the names of the victims are indicated, and in the upper part, its purpose is carved in memory of the Gokhtian repressed in 1937 and 38. As the authors explained, they deliberately chose such an inscription so that the Stalin's name was not mentioned in it, because he was unworthy to be immortalized. At the same time, among the names of the monument was the name of the person who reported on the other victims indicated on the same stone. Those, in turn, having conspired as retribution, named him as one of their associates. As a result, the informer was shot as well as those on whom he reported. Thus, the names of both the victims and the traitor, who in turn also became a victim, are recorded on the monument. And as the initiator explained, the purpose of this monument was to raise the issue of guilt and place it on a regime that forced people to denounce each other. And those who fell, both victims and executioners, were perceived as the victims of the regime, of which they saw Stalin as the main architect. Therefore, unlike their local executioners, they deprived him of the right to memory. It is difficult to find the appropriate public non-private space for the new monument. It is required to go through some bureaucratic procedure for getting the permission for that. The easiest solution to this problem is to erect a monument on a private property. Thus, a new memorial landscape appeared on a private territory with the function of a public space. Sometimes the text itself of such monument is very private, having its own family or relatives as an addressee. For example, in the village of Artablu, a monument to repressed relatives was presented in the form of a genealogical tree, which indicates the family ties of 17 victims of the same family in different ways of repressions in 1937, 38, and 1949. The monument to the repressed from this family is presented on the territory of private garden of one of the descendants, which is gradually turning into a public memorial park, where there are several other monuments that have nothing to do with family history. This memorial park is an example of alternative shifting of private memory into public space. So, to conclude, I tried to demonstrate how the traumatic memory of genocide survivors and repression survivors interact multidirectionally. While the memory of the genocide has become an important part of not only the politics of memory in post-Soviet Armenia, but was influenced by the Soviet patriotic war narration of the Soviet period as well. The memory of the repressions has been rather part of the politics of oblivion, largely due to cautious relations with Russia, which since the mid-2000s began to revise its negative attitude towards the Soviet past. The policy of oblivion of the Soviet past at the same time created fertile ground for less politicization of the collective memory of the repressions. This opened up more space for quantum memory, for expressing an ambiguous attitude towards the victims and executioners of Soviet repressions. The perspectives of victims and executioners have been reflected differently on the memorial landscape. Local initiatives of memorializing the victims of the Soviet regime reveal a wide spectrum of interpretations of these suppressions, distinct from the unambiguous message of the main memorial in Vienna.
Anybody have questions? Sure. Thank you, Gayane. Any questions?
I have a very quick question for maybe I misunderstood. This Soviet memorization that is established in Yerevan, you told in talk that it's open only on one day and the other day are closed.
Yeah.
I don't understand the logic behind it.
Yeah. You see, the building, the memorial itself is a huge building.
Correct.
And it has a lot of free spaces, and they have a door. And in order to escape coming like animals, dogs, and just homeless and so on, they had to close this door. But because the monument has a very ununderstandable status, who is responsible for this monument, nobody can just open every day the monument. That's why, because of the Remembrance Day, many people or some of them come to the memorial. The organization Hushamatyan, who was one of the initiator of this memorial as well. They have the key for this memorial. So they opened this day in order to do their commemorations. And then because nobody can care of this memorial, they had to lock it. This is the problem of maintenance. And the memorial at this moment is under of Gafeshan management, but it isn't their property. So this is the problem of maintenance the memorial and divide the responsibility between municipality and the private Gafeshan Foundation because at this moment they are managed all of this cascade. This is the just nonsense, but
I mean, it seems that there is no political will behind this.
No, there is no any political. This is again we can consider as a part of the absence of any policy related to this topic. I mean, we can call it like policy of oblivion or just absent policy.
I have a question about the Hushamatyan initiative. Like, how did they start and what do they do? So I have a sense that after your presentation, it needs a lot of internal working through the past, because as you put it, like victims and executioners, the divide is very blurry. So it requires a lot of like internal within Armenia, a lot of working through the past. So how are they addressing this difficult issue, really? Because both the descendants of the victims and descendants of executioners are still in Armenia.
Yes, there's some problems in this sense, but actually the initiative of Hushamatyan was launched earlier than this monument was built. They started their activities in a period of perestroika, even before this independence period. It was like a bunch of the international memorial, and they had the same team and collaborate with memorial and so on. And that period they had a lot of publications in newspapers and before this monument, they put themselves across stone on the cascade, but not on the same place, a bit below, and just did a commemoration on that day. After their initiatives, Jean Torosan initiated to build this huge monument because the other monument on the same place, the monument which is for Stella, huge Stella, which is called in Yerevan Monument itself, and it is dedicated to 50th anniversary of Sovietization of Armenia, was done by him. Again, so this is some kind of his own place, and that's why, as an architect of this cascade of this place, he could initiate to build one more monument as well. So after building, the Hushamatyan moved their commemoration place to this place. But actually now, Hushamatyan is an NGO of very elder people, and because they are married their relatives or the people who were deported or even they birth in Siberia. And so these people was born in Siberia. So these people had many social problems, and very often these kind of commemorations turned into the social protest form for like protest for their rights to do something for get some privileges, how it done, for example, in Russia or other post-Soviet republics. For them, there is not a problems between executioners and victims, because all of them are on one camp and nobody came to this day from the other. But we recorded a lot of stories during our field works. So on the level of the village, of course, there's some problem, and attitude to the let's say executions or even a descendant mainly depends on what kind of descendants they have. Their own biography is much more important for the villagers than the biography of their ancestors.
Could I ask you to say a little bit more about the targets of the Stalinist repressions? You had talked about the Armenians who had just recently escaped from Turkey, who were survivors of the Armenian Genocide, but then you also mentioned earlier that they targeted Tashnags and others of, various perhaps political persuasions that you could elaborate.
I talked about very concrete the deportation contingent. It was officially called the social groups, Tashnags, former Turkish and Greek citizens, or current Turkish and Greek citizens. That's all. But in general, we have now we have the database on all Armenian political prisoners in Soviet period, and the number is 45,000 people. And by the way, it is not a huge one compared with other republics. For example, in Armenia, we have about 5,000 executions, people who were killed. And at the same time, in the neighboring republics, the number much more. And for us, is the issue not why Armenians so many, but in contrary, why they are less compared with the other republics. And the answer is because of social strata. After the genocide, of course, we don't have a lot of rich people or high-level population, I mean the social level, because almost there were not any big cities in Armenia, and Armenian intellectuals and other kind of more or less rich people were in Tbilisi, in Baku, in other Caucasian, in Shushi, in other Caucasian cities. And that's why a lot of Armenians were deported or killed, executed from Georgia, Azerbaijan, and other cities also. So the number 45,000 people, I mean the citizens only in Soviet Armenia, because we have the accessibility to only our national archive. And there's no idea about the number in Azerbaijan, and we have some ideas about in Georgia, because our group, in particular, Harajan, worked their archives as well.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question. Were there any differences between 1937 purges and 1949? So because I study Zabeliesa and I know her story from 37 purges, and the time between 37 and 49, that period is also very interesting because like 37, the purges, they knew that these people, and you said that the memory is not ethnicized, but most of these intellectuals, at least I know Zabel Sayan, was persecuted on the basis of the accusation of being a nationalist, although she was very pro-Soviet and she worked for repatriation. But in 1949, you have the repatriated Armenians, as you said. So the period between 37 and 49 is like 12 years. So
Yeah, it doesn't mean that between 38 and 49 there was not any repression. Repressions was going on all of this period. But 1937 and 38, this is the period of, let's say, great terror. Was launched by Yagata, then Yezhov, and then when Beryl came, it was a little bit go down, but went down. But it doesn't mean that it stopped. No, all of this period, the repression was continuing, and especially during the Second World War, there was a lot of repression and so on. But in 1949, we had the mass deportation from Armenia. And even this doesn't mean that we haven't other deportation, I mean mass deportation, because for example, in 1944, it was mass deportation from Crimea, and Armenia was included as a punished people in Crimea who was deported to Siberia. So all of this period, the repression was going ongoing, but in some period was like peak, the huge number of this period just grown.
yeah, I guess my question is like before, because they
Oh, wait.
already knew by 1937, 38,
Yeah,
but they still worked for Stalin's agenda of repatriation because of, I mean, we know why, but it's now that I'm looking back and thinking, all these like 12 years, I mean, was it preventable? Like, because
no,
uh,
everyone was frightened and everything was going on like if Stalin was ruling. So nobody in this sense changed, and just some rulers change each other. For example, the team of Yagoda was changed with shifted with team of Yezhov, and Yezhov was also killed, and then there the system came, and all of this period, it was just this smaller, very likely changes in the form of repression, but they were continued till to the end of the Soviet period. We had some political prisoners even in 1980s. So this is the kind of regime country, so you can't say anything about stopping of repressions. Just change the form.
yeah, I'm more interested in like, do you know if there's any study of how the news were circulated outside Soviet Armenia? So like, for example, 37, 38, 39, of course, like it's the Second World War, but those people who are in the diaspora working for repatriation, do you know if they knew that these deportations already started? And so, because
No,
then they
no,
wouldn't. So
no,
that's my
so,
question. Yeah.
sure,
So
they didn't know. Of course,
yeah.
they didn't know. And after their victory in the Second World War, many people were so impressed. And after this special campaign which Soviet started, because Stalin thought about started the war against Turkey, and this deportation with repatriation, he saw they were using these people, but to the end of 1946, he realized that it will be not possible, and these people who were, because of special campaign, collected and moved to Armenia. At that moment, from that moment, the government didn't need them, and so they stopped this repatriation campaign, and 10% of these repatriators also were deported to Siberia. About 1,200 or 500 people deported to Siberia within this Wagner operation.
I mean, it's a fascinating topic. The basic question is, of course, that we don't know much. And I have the really necessity to learn more in order to be able to compare with the other kind of memorialization and so on. This is really, in that sense, very important to have a lecture specifically on the Stalinist period of persecution. You already gave some clues to us why it is so taboo in that society still. This is very common in all other societies also. The boundaries between victims and perpetrators are not so clear. It goes through each families. It is destructive, and you cannot ethnicize all these conflicts and so on and so forth. But then this is my question also. It seems that to send this into oblivion is not only a government policy. It is the societal attitude towards a past. They don't know when they scratch this wound, what will come out of it.
Yeah.
This insecurity about the past, I think, is one of the major problems also.
Yeah, I think you are right. But plus, I think the inertia from the Soviet period, when it will be better, don't touch this topic. It will be more safe.
To me, that begs the question, the recognition, even on June 14, over the years, let's say since 2008, you said, was it different during the period of Serge Sarkisian, for example, versus the early period of Nikol Pashinyan, given the differences in the relationship between those leaders and, say, Russia?
Actually, on the level of participation in commemoration, officially there's no difference. But because of this memorial is like abandoned and sometimes it's very dirty, because of there's some space and does this always there. And this year, the Ministry of Justice organized Subotnik, just voluntary to cleaning this territory. Yeah, this is, I can say, the only form of their attitude to this memorial. But even after that, they did nothing to do more clear the status of the memorial. So this is the still on the agenda. They should find some solution for organizing better maintenance.
I think we have a couple of questions from the audience on Zoom.
We do. Yes. First question, they're both thanking you for the presentation and the scholarship. And the first question asks, I appreciate the breadth of the scholarship that you cite from the fields of memory studies and trauma studies, which have by and large been produced in the US and European academies. And they would like to ask you to speak on A, how prevalent is the instruction of these bodies of scholarship in universities in Armenia, or B, how you came to this field of trauma and memory studies if it wasn't prevalent in Armenian universities.
Thank you for the question. Actually, unfortunately, we don't have this special course or as a regular course in the universities. But I organized the Memory Studies Center at the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography within the Academic Sciences of Armenia. So this center, time to time, organizing the oral history courses and the researchers and so on. Of course, we have the Institute Museum of Genocide, which is also the very institutionalized form of study the memory, and they also do a lot of work in this field.
Oh, in this time period, it is a part of the Genocide Museum also?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Not related to especially this period, but as a memory studies, as a theoretical framework, I mean, in the sense of more larger framework. I mean, the methodology of oral histories and something like that.
There are a couple more questions. Can you say a few words about how the Stalinist repressions are taught in Armenian primary schools, if at all, and how will the monuments to the victims of the repression be understood by the public?
Okay. It's very interesting question because when we had studied our research, in 2013, 14, and tried to find any information on internet, we could find the only blog from school children, school, who have blogs, a lot of blogs, and put there some information on repressions and so on. And when we visited the memorial on the day, on June 14, we saw that some school children from this school were there and tried to record these people who were gathered there. So this is a very interesting for us because these school children were even earlier than we, but I have to say this is the only school and this is the initiative only one teacher of history. So the other schools, I think of course, in the textbooks, we have the special chapters on repressions in Soviet Union and in Armenia in particular. But this is like another chapters, which is very a lot of numbers you can find there. There is no people's stories and so forth. For people, it's very hard to understand what was at the time.
Okay, well, thank you so much. What a fascinating lecture. For joining us.
Questions and
Yeah.
comments.